Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm joined by Alex Chesterfield, a behavioural scientist who has some fascinating human risk insights to share. Not just from her work inside a regulator, but also from a project she's part of that seeks to explore polarisation and what we can do to mitigate it. In the first part of our discussion, we explore Alex's background, how she got into behavioural science, and in particular her experience at the UK's FCA, or Financial Conduct Authority, a regulator that was set up specifically to manage conduct, in other words, behaviour, in the financial industry. She was hired into a team of behavioural scientists that the FCA had employed to help it understand the impact of its rules on consumer behaviour. In other words, to check that the outcomes the regulator was hoping to achieve through regulation, for example, getting people to save more for retirement, were actually working as intended. Now, I know many listeners might be surprised to hear that regulators employ behavioural scientists. After all, there are plenty of examples of dumb regulation that really doesn't think about the behavioural aspects of what the regulator is trying to achieve. But there are some regulators, admittedly a limited number, that do understand the importance of having behavioural science as part of their toolkit. But as Alex explains, it's not always easy for regulators to create regulatory environments that always work well from a behavioural perspective. In the second part of our discussion, we explore a fascinating project that Alex is involved with called the Depolarization Project. As the name implies, the idea is to explore why we live in a polarised world, what that means, both good and bad, and what we can do to tackle it when it reaches pernicious levels. As well as training and research, the project has its own podcast called Change My Mind, in which Alex and her colleagues speak to people who have, this will surprise you, changed their mind on big issues. There's a link to that and some of the other topics we discussed in the show notes. If you're thinking that sounds like a podcast of two halves, you're completely right and completely wrong, because somehow we managed to effortlessly glide from one subject to the other. And while we could have filled an entire episode talking about one or other of the two topics, I wanted to give you a feel for both aspects of Alex's experiences in one episode. So please enjoy a fascinating exploration of behavioural science and regulation and depolarization in my discussion with Alex Chesterfield. Alex, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you, Christian. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here. And look, I thought it'd probably be a good idea to start by just talking a little bit about you. And can you give my listeners a little bit of a sense of who you are and how you came to get into behavioural science?
Yeah, so I mean, it's definitely a non-linear, maybe non-straightforward or non-classic route. So I started off, actually did English literature at uni, 8 years and years and years ago. I was always really interested in stories. Got onto a grad scheme. I was doing PR, advertising. Actually hated PR. Quickly realised that I wasn't very good at selling or telling stories in a particular way. So luckily, I got on the grad scheme. I was in a research arm, but the research was mainly social and market research. So using things like interviews, focus groups, surveys to try and understand attitudes and behaviours. So, one day I might be speaking to really vulnerable kids in a care home, trying to understand about their experience living in social care. The next day I remember doing events with, this was back this is going to reveal my age, but with, and Gordon Brown was PM and his cabinet doing big events with the public and ministers on a particular policy proposal. To try and bring that again, how might this policy land? How might it work with real people rather than just that political view? So I loved that, did it for a few years, but then started to think, actually, what is happening to my research? What impact is it having? So then I went to Which. Now, when I say Which, most people are going to be thinking kettles, toasters, etc.
So for non-UK listeners, this is a consumer. It's not consumer protection, but they sort of do reviews of products and keep an eye out and sort of look after consumers. And there's a subscription you can have to a magazine that will review products, and it's neutral. And therefore, it's really designed as a consumer guide. That's what.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's the business model. But then the commercial part of the business, which is the subscription part, funds the charitable part, and that helps. So it's got policy people, campaign people, research people. It's designed to try and help make different consumer markets, fairer, simpler for people to, for consumers, essentially. Anyway, so got in there and quickly started to realize, hang on, what people say isn't always what they do. So I remember doing research with customers around pensions and, again, using self-report methods like focus groups and interviews and asking people, why aren't you saving? And people would be like, oh, I haven't got enough information. And then we designed this research in a way that we'd actually give people information and go back and then see, actually, were they saving into a pension? I mean, you can probably guess the answer. Of course, they weren't saving into a pension. So I was like, hang on a minute, this just doesn't make sense. Again, what people do, whether it's on saving into a pension, whether it's exercising, whether it's eating more healthily, doesn't actually correspond to how they behave. So at the same time, again, this is going to reveal my age, at the same time, the nudge unit was being set up. And you had the nudge book, just recently published. And I began to see, again, we were trying to influence, politicians, regulators, business to change either the law, to change regulation, or change business practice to help consumers. I could see the way that evidence was being used and what evidence was being used to influence decision makers was changing, and using focus groups, surveys, self-report methods was no longer strong enough or influential enough to help make the world simpler and fairer for consumers. So I pitched to the board at Which and said, I think we need a behavioural science team. Clearly, I felt a bit of a fraudster because I had yes, I'd done years of research, speaking to people, living or observing people, but it didn't know any of the theory. And luckily for me, the board sent me to UCL. So I went to do a master's part-time. And I was on maternity leave with my second daughter, which was hardcore, but I loved it. And that was around cognitive and decision making. And I absolutely, it was flipping hard. But I just absolutely loved it. So it was then that I decided, actually, I want to find a role where I can leave management, because I was heading up this team. And I love that management part, but actually I wanted to go back and deepen and get really stuck into using behavioural science for a couple of years. So that's what then prompted me to start looking around and ended up going to the FCA. So the financial regulator was doing a bunch of really innovative work. They'd set up a team, a behavioural economics team that was led by Stefan Hunt, who's now the competition regulator. He'd set up a team to try and make regulation more realistic. So, for years, regulation had been designed by, no offense to any economists or lawyers who are listening to this, but have been designed by economists and lawyers who are very good at a lot of things, but they're not always good at figuring actually how do people really behave, not what our models might suggest, that are very mathematically beautiful and very accurate, but actually doesn't always correspond to reality. So that's why I ended up going to the behavioural economics team at the FCA. And that's how really, I guess that's the story of how I got into behavioural science. So I was there for 3 years, using methods and theories from behavioural science to try and design and road test better regulation. A lot of the time we're actually, stopping regulation or trying to stop regulation because it wasn't having the effects that we might have intended. So I'll pause there. But that's my probably pretty long story of how I got into it.
But I love that because I think that it chimes with my own experience of kind of recognizing there's something there, and you sort of go, this doesn't quite feel right. And the traditional models that are used to sort of run the world almost, have flaws in them. And I love the way you were talking about it. You sort of going, I need to understand why this is, why is this? There's this gap between the way we think the world operates and the way it actually seems to, and I need to close that gap. And then I love that you then go and put that into practice. It's exactly that piece of sort of saying, okay, I'm now in a part of the world, the regulator is trying to control an industry, and we all understand why that industry needs controlling. So there's a clear need for regulation in that space. But obviously you've got to get it right. It needs to be effective. And the bit I find fascinating is that when you look at all regulation, but particularly financial services, very heavily focused on people and the behaviors, because that was what drove the financial crisis and some of the consequences that we didn't want societally. So you're sitting in a space, particularly in that regulator that has a focus on conduct, which is for people outside the industry, is literally human behavior. It's how people are behaving in that industry. And so you're taking it to sort of really important space and saying, okay, we want to get this right. And if our job is to influence human decision-making, we better make sure that we understand the consequences of it. And I love this idea of sort of a regulator being, slowed down a bit from doing things that it might naturally historically have done. Approaches that seem logical, but actually in practice are flawed. And I find that for me is fascinating. I think it's great that, one, that was considered by the regulator, and two, that someone like you who had that curiosity was in that position to start influencing in that way.
It was, as I said, it was really hard though, because again, the idea of going in and saying actually what the current approaches, whether it is these classic economic models or just going out to ask people, what it is, how are you tell me about your, why aren't you switching current accounts? And you get, very, very rational, logical sounding answers. And then you test things only on that basis, but they just wouldn't work. So actually changing customers or changing consumers' behavior was in reality really, really hard. And a lot of the earlier randomized controlled trials that were run in the team at the FCA were focused on disclosure. Again, on the assumption that, well, people maybe don't understand what it is that they're buying. So therefore, the solution will be, let's give them more information in a more, smart disclosure way. So let's give them more simple information, or let's make it more salient, or let's give them the information at the time that they're making the decision. Again, which is a big contrast to education. I'll come back to that in a minute. But even sometimes those when we trial it, so we had a control group, we had a treatment group, often those disclosure-based remedies don't work. And that's really hard, again, for a regulator, when you come back with your, study, which it's not an overnight thing either, to say, actually, we went away, we did this work for months and months, and actually nothing's worked. So we need to go back to the drawing board, and we need to try something different. That's really, really hard. So it takes a lot of guts to say we're gonna test this empirically, we're gonna see what works, because sometimes having the answer we don't know what works can be seen as failure. It's not, you've learned something, but it's really hard to frame it in that way as we've learned something rather than it's just failed and we therefore need to go back to the drawing board. That's not what people want to hear a lot of the time.
And you mentioned the word education.
Yeah. So coming from which is a consumers association that had a brilliant legacy in helping to make the world a safer, better place for consumers. And one of the things, one of its core principles was education. Again, helping to inform consumers about their consumer rights and, giving them the right information, helping people to make the right choices when they are buying, whether it is a toaster or whether it's choosing their GP or choosing the hospital, to have an operation. So there is this assumption that actually education and more education will lead to better decisions. It just feels, it's very intuitive, isn't it? We send our kids to school, it makes total sense. But in financial services, there's a lot of evidence. There's a meta-analysis done, which is where behavioural scientists look at lots of studies and then aggregate them all up to look at actually what is the overall effect of financial education. And the evidence is really clear that financial education has very little impact on actual behaviours. So you can give people information on the importance of saving, on how to save, but that rarely translates into people actually saving more in the longer term. So again, it comes back to that problem of knowing what to do doesn't mean people will necessarily do it. Again, and that's really hard because across government, you've got and across banking, you have a lot of really what seem like great, really important schemes to help people learn, but are they actually having the intended effect, i.e., helping people to manage their money better, to save more, to avoid fees? It's the science suggests maybe not.
And of course, one of the challenges regulators have is that they are themselves under scrutiny. And so, they are accountable to government, who in turn are then accountable to voters. So you look at the world and say, first off, we have to solve the problem because that's what we're here to do. But secondly, there is that element of being seen to solve the problem and sort of managing the PR around it. And one of the things I think is really fascinating is when people criticize regulators, and sometimes totally correctly, right? Regulators have made and continue to make bad calls because guess what? They're human.
Yeah.
But very often the pressures on them are the same sort of pressures that you see within companies, which is the sort of idea of, we need to do something and be seen to be doing something.
Yeah.
And we will therefore make decisions based around the optics of it. And so sometimes you can have techniques that are deployed that almost, they may know that they're not the most effective techniques, but it's very difficult to justify things. So when I look at certain regulations, we know they're ineffective. But if you remove a regulation, you're suddenly in the realms of, well, they're letting up on that industry. That's disgraceful. They're letting them off.
Yeah.
And so I think for me that's a fascinating piece around there's a sort of, there are pressures on regulators that are invisible unless you've been in them and you start to look at this thing. And so I find that fascinating. So you can't go for the optimal answer in a way that you could in a company, because you actually have to account for yourself. And it's much easier to talk about traditional methods and traditional approaches because that's what people expect you to do.
Yeah. Definitely. There's I think it's I mean, I hate using the word bias, but I think there is something called action bias. And you see that everywhere, but again, it's very, you see it again explicitly in regulation. There's, a problem happens, or there's a clear problem facing consumers, whether it's in savings, credit cards, whatever particular market it is. And again, there is that call, or something blows up, right? What is the regulator going to do? There's that desire for fast action, just to be seen to be doing something. You need to be solving this problem, but actually, to solve the problem, you often need to diagnose, okay, well, why has this happened? What are the root causes? And then test a whole bunch of things. Again, come back to the other point, changing our behavior is really hard. You need to try different things, and that takes time. But time is not something that a regulator, under a lot of pressure, often has or wants to hear. So it is very difficult. Actually, that's one of the reasons why increasingly the team, this is just before I left, but we were using online experiments increasingly more rather than doing big field trials that take months and months and months with firms, is trying to simulate online the decision that the customer or the consumer might be doing, and then changing that, hypothetically changing that choice to try and see, well, actually, what impact might version A have on the customer decision versus version B, which is faster. And again, it still allows us to have some more confidence in actually whatever rules or regulation might change, but it is based on evidence. But yeah, evidence-based decision making is really hard to do under any kind of time pressure.
And I think particularly when you think about the industry as a moving target. So it's not as if you looked at something like utility companies, where it's fixed pipes and the product remains, so electricity remains electricity. And so you've got almost some dynamics that are fairly static. If you look at something like financial services, things are shifting all the time. Something like, cryptocurrencies come along, and that can change the dynamic. So something that works, may work reasonably well for circumstance A, might not when something new comes across the horizon. And I think one of the challenges in financial services is that it's moving so quickly. You have an industry that is nimble, tries new things, is adopting new technologies, and kind of gallop, a little bit like the tech industry now, is kind of galloping ahead. And so the challenges you talk about would be difficult enough in a static environment. They get a heck of a lot harder when you can very quickly have unintended consequences because you write rules for a world that you understand. And COVID is another good example where things are shifting very quickly. Yeah. Keeping up with that alongside those dynamics you talked about, really tough.
It is really tough, and in an ideal world. But again, when things are so uncertain and volatile, it's almost more of an argument for experimentation to de-risk, because it takes out some of that uncertainty that you can see, well, what happens in these different dynamic contexts. But again, that was, in an ideal world, you'd have almost ongoing experimentation, but that doesn't work. The regulator that needs to put things into rules, and again, give that consistency for firms. So yeah, I haven't got an answer to that, but it is really difficult. And again, I remember these unintended consequences. This is probably what we used to call a waterbed effect. So, you might make one change to the market over here, but it would actually cause another problem over here for a different group of customers, or in the longer term, which you just don't always know in advance. So yeah, it's hard. Actually, I remember in energy, actually, with the regulation, was it when they brought in the maximum of 4 tariffs? I think 4 energy tariffs, that caused a bunch of, I remember that causing this was when I was at Which, a bunch of downstream problems for customers. Actually simplifying the choice, that again seemed very intuitively sensible, didn't actually have the effects that it was meant to have further downstream.
I love hearing this because this sort of takes me back to my time at the regulator. And, you suddenly, when you see inside, there are things that are shocking. You go, do they really do it like that? Wow. And then you discover very often there's method to the madness. And I think one of the things that's really interesting when you come in from the outside is that, well, I'm going to change the following things, and they're not going to. And of course, some of it you're spot on, but some of it, as I say, is sort of, you start to recognize it's a little bit harder than it looks.
It is. Yeah. Because again, I remember when I first went in, I was like, right, the team again that I was working with at the FCA, we're all, very, really into experimentation and randomized controlled trials and doing it all very rigorously. I'm doing it with firms. And again, we probably had this very ignorant perspective that it was very easy for large banks to just change at the drop of a hat, all their letters, all their kind of, well, yes, letters is quite a good example, letters going out to customers advising them of a change in their products. Say, for example, an interest rate change, or that there's a new product coming on that they might be better off on. Probably quite naively, we'd be like, oh, well, of course, can't you just change your letter so you have 10 different versions? Not realizing that actually changing a very old legacy system sometimes it's just impossible, but it takes a ton of time. And that time, obviously, for firms means cost. And where does that cost get passed down to? Inevitably, the cost gets passed down to
the very customers you're trying to protect.
Exactly,
right?
We're trying to protect. And then it's like, oh my God. So again, I remember at Which, again, probably quite ignorantly or quite naively, making these calls, claims that firms should be doing X, Y, Z, and then inevitably, as you said, when you get into a company and you see, or an organization, you see it from the inside, it's more complex and has all these other potentials. So it's a system type problem, isn't it? You pull one lever, but it has an effect over there. So how do you factor that into the decision making? Again, it comes back to the try and experiment. And how can you experiment more quickly?
I mean, it's fascinating when you talk about the cost of these changes. I mean, I was doing some work with a client that I won't name, where we wanted to, I just said, let's just try changing one of the email, because it was a particularly unhelpful email that screamed, this training you're about to go on is really boring. And I just said, let's just take that word out. It's unnecessary. I mean, an example would be the word compliance in an email subject, right? Never gets anyone excited.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's going to reduce the open rate. Yeah.
Right. And then, and so I just said, let's just take that, make a few changes, make a few minor changes. And it turned out it was something like £50,000 to change this particular wording. Now, in that case, it was because they'd signed up with a training provider and kind of locked themselves into a really bad deal, which made me laugh, because it was the sort of equivalent of financial services customers locking themselves into a really bad deal.
And then having to pay to get out.
And it was like 50,000 to change this thing. And you're right. You look at it and just go, I mean, that's an extreme example, because it was a bit of bad thinking. Why would we ever need to change the wording on an email?
Yeah.
Well, now we know that that's actually quite a useful thing to be able to do.
Yeah.
But I just looked at that. That was one, and that was a financial obstacle as opposed to a systems obstacle. But there's a ton of these reasons why ought to be happening. And if you were starting again, you wouldn't be designing the world in that way. But we inherit these obstacles and impediments that I think make it challenging, because we sort of try and drive towards, the best we can. And yet the constraints around that are quite extent. And that can be quite frustrating, because you sort of know what it could be, but you have to recognize reality.
Yeah, yeah. And I remember coming back to your earlier point as well on this, this idea of a dynamic system and trying to experiment and test. I remember one good example, and this is all published, but the team that I was working in did research on it was in insurance, so in insurance, general insurance market, and the challenge or the problem facing consumers was it was consumers not renewing. So every year having to renew your insurance, consumers often wouldn't switch. They'd stick with their provider rather than shopping around, which is what you ideally would want people to do, because they can get much better deals. They can save over hundreds of pounds a year. So again, from a economic perspective, that makes a lot of sense. But customers, it takes a lot of effort, a lot of hassle. You just can't be bothered, so you just stick with your provider. So the team had done a bunch of randomized controlled trials showing actually if you put the price of last year's quote on the renewal letter that was being sent to customers, that might prompt them, might make that I guess that money saving opportunity more salient at the decision point. The customers are thinking, well, actually, should I just auto renew with my current provider, or should I maybe switch and shop around? And I think this is from memory. So I'll go back and double check this after. But I think from memory, the trial showed that actually it had an effect, that it caused more customers to switch from their provider and go to a different provider. So it had a good kind of, from a kind of market competition perspective, it had a good outcome, and customers were paying less for their insurance. But when that was written into regulation, that firms had to put on this price, the way the regulation was written and the way that firms responded, some firms responded, by no means all, is that it didn't go on the front. It went on page 3 of the letter, right at the back in the small print, which, you can guess it, no one read. So it didn't have that desired effect. And then the challenge to the regulator is then, well, hang on, do we have to start getting really, really, prescriptive on how much detail we have to say in the rules that firms have to put it, on the front page, in the top right-hand corner, in this color, which starts to make a complex rule book even more complicated. But that's the kind of dynamic challenges that you face. You're trying to help customers and trying to help consumers, and firms have don't always respond in the way that you might want them to. So that was tricky.
I love well-intentioned things going hideously wrong. And you mentioned before this idea of disclosure, which was always seen as the big panacea. And I love that thing where you sort of go, emotionally, I understand entirely. Well, we'll just tell people are intelligent. We'll just tell them what's going on here. And you have all of those unintended consequences of, firstly, people just go, oh, there's a whole load of stuff. Can't be bothered to read any of this stuff. And then taking assurance from the fact that because there's a load of regulatory blurb on it, someone somewhere's kept an eye on this, right? This is regulated, so they wouldn't be allowed to do this stuff if it were really bad for me. So far from the thing that is designed to make you pay more attention and be careful, that sort of regulatory warning text that's there, actually has the opposite effect, which is people go, oh, well, that's okay. It doesn't matter. At least someone's looked at this, right? We've got a regulator. That's what we pay them to do, so I'm okay. And so the thing that's designed to get you to pay more attention actually has the opposite effect.
Yeah. Yeah. And even some things that were, so again, that was in the early days, is like tried loads of different disclosure type things and would see either no effect or very small effects of these, very behaviourally informed disclosures, which was gutting. But at least again, you learn and you think, okay, right, we need to try something different. So again, this was only a couple of years ago, another problem that we found was minimum repayments in credit card disclosures. So again, here, just for the listeners, the challenge was when customers are paying back their or deciding how to repay their credit card debt, they often just choose the minimum repayment. So when you look at, it's like a U-shaped curve. So around 25% of customers just choose to pay the minimum, 25% of customers choose to pay off the entire amount of their balance, and the remaining half is somewhere in between. But the problem with just paying off the minimum is it takes you way longer to repay your credit card debt, and you pay more in interest. So the challenge from a behavioural perspective is, well, how can we help customers to pay off less by not choosing the minimum repayment? And from a psychological perspective, we hypothesized that minimum repayment was a bit like acting like an anchoring effect. So i.e. people would, you'd see it and you'd think it was to your point, you'd see, it's a recommendation. That's how much I should pay. That's how much the bank's almost saying, this is the minimum. They you assume it's a recommendation. And it essentially drags down the amount that you choose to repay. If it wasn't there, we figured that actually people would choose to pay off more. And the team actually working with people from academics from Warwick and Harvard, again, worked with a number of banks. So again, we didn't use disclosure. We actually changed the choice architecture of those repayment screens in real time that customers were seeing. And initially there was a really good, a really strong effect. And actually the effect was so strong, I think, one of the banks pulled out the trial because this effect was so strong in the numbers of customers choosing to pay more than the minimum amount. So we were like, great, this is brilliant. I remember the team, there was like cracking open drinks after work. Everyone was really, really pleased.
I mean, but that's fascinating, right? Because that has to be really bad for them to pull out. Are you really good from your perspective? But because you'd be sitting there going, if I pull out of this trial that I'm doing with the regulator, I'm sending a signal. So it's got to be having a major impact. In other words, even more successful than you might think.
Yeah. So it was, but this was just an initial effect. And again, the team, the guys and girls working on this were super smart and actually said, this is an initial effect, but our outcome, what we're really interested in is, does this help customers in the longer time to reduce their overall debt? That's what we need to be looking at. So when they looked at the differences in account balances between the control group and the treatment groups in 6 months, so over the longer term, what they found actually was zero effect at the end. So when they dug into the data a bit more, I'm simplifying it a bit, but what they found was that customers who were choosing, so the treatment group, customers that were choosing to pay more than the minimum, would actually make less frequent top-ups in the month. So if you imagine historically, all customers might have chosen the minimum repayment when they had a bit more money at the end of the month. They might chuck that on their credit card to pay off a bit more of a balance. When customers had chosen not to pay the minimum, so when they were choosing to pay a bit more off their balance, they then just reduced those manual top-ups throughout the month, or if they were still making the manual top-ups, they would just pay off less. So overall, there was a net zero effect. So again, the point, I guess the message from that is to look at, looking at behavior change over time, and just that complexity point. It was really hard to change. Yeah, it's really hard to change behavior. And actually, customers were probably paying more attention as well to their balances than we thought over time. So actually, it's similar. One other point, actually, similar to that. I think this just shows, again, how behavioural science is evolving as a field. When we started off, it was like, great, these simple nudges can really work, or these simple changes to disclosure can work. I think now we're seeing, actually, it's a lot harder. Auto-enrollment, which is probably the poster child for behavioural science. Again, for listeners, auto-enrollment is in pensions, where the default was changed from opt-in to opt-out. So previously you had to decide, you had to do all the paperwork, you had to opt into your employer's pension. Now, the rules and regulations were changed from the government perspective. Auto-enrollment means that your employer automatically opts you into a pension, and all the effort and hassle is now on having to come out. So as a result, as a consequence, pension participation rates went up massively. But there was some research in the States that came out showing, again, an unintended consequence of that was people are borrowing more because they are now saving more into a pension. So it's like robbing Peter to pay Paul. Is that the phrase?
Yeah.
So again, there's no net benefit. So it's like, it just shows it's really hard. Actually, Greg Davies is great on this point as well, on auto enrollment and actually the downsides of it. And are we getting the full picture of its effects?
When you talk like that, you sort of go, oh, we should just stop doing this, right? This is too hard.
Yeah.
But then you sit there and go, actually, and I think this is a really, really useful point for people to grasp, is that people often talk about, we're now deploying behavioural science. But of course, you are using techniques, whether you know it or not, and whether you're doing it well or not already. Yeah. And so it's not something that you're suddenly switching on. It is something that has implicitly already been there. And I think that, that's why I think it's really powerful to have a unit at the regulator that is doing this stuff, because then you're sending a signal to the industry. Actually, look, we recognize that some of the things that we're doing, and therefore by implication, some of the stuff you're doing internally and to your customers comes with unintended consequences, and we need to clean this thing up. And I think the message, I'm not sure it's always got through to individual firms, but I think that's a very strong, not just in terms of actually cleaning up, but the signaling effect that says, look, if we as the regulator, and we have a ton of power and influence, and of course with power comes responsibility, but we're looking at cleaning our own thing up, because we recognize that actually humans don't operate in the way that we want them to. So we have to think about, one, the consequences on you, but also how we're running internally. Yeah. I think that's a very powerful signal that hasn't necessarily always been picked up, but I think will over time. Yeah. That says, look, if we're cleaning our own act up on this stuff, you need to be thinking in those terms yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. And the message to firms as well. I mean, this was, again, because it was all voluntary when firms worked with the regulator on these kinds of trials. It was very much, again, another outcome or another benefit of you working with us is that we don't end up running out regulation or rolling out regulation that actually in the end doesn't benefit customers, and it incurs a bunch of costs and hassle for you, and it doesn't work for anyone. So yeah, it was very much designed, that team, to be a win-win.
And yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you could sort of go, I'm not going to participate in their thing because ultimately it's not going to be in my interest to do that. But actually it is, because your alternatives, the alternative narrative to they're going to tighten the rules and reduce my profitability is they could do something even worse.
Just put in rules that cost a bunch of money, a bunch of time and effort, and don't actually help the customer or the firm. So,
yeah. And how has having done that role changed you as a consumer? Because in theory, you ought to be. I'll sort of set this up slightly, but in theory, you ought to be a much sharper, more intelligent consumer, much more aware about these things. Have you found that happening, or is it a little bit like taking work home when you go, enough now?
Christian, that's such a good question. It's like a doctor that smokes. I'm like a doctor that smokes. Basically, no. So I always call myself a real consumer, i.e., I'm someone that does not look at the small print. I'm someone that very much prioritizes the here and now over the future. I'm someone that, thinks about how others might think of me rather than, I wouldn't say I'm entirely, make decisions for entirely my gains rather than others. So yeah, I know, let's just say there's room for improvement, considerable room for improvement. I think it has made me more aware of, I guess getting my partner involved in let's say household financial decision making. So it's definitely not left to me. It's not really my strength. I'd say it's his. It's made me much more aware that he is, I think, from a household financial perspective, he does all the right stuff, makes the decisions in all the right way. So I feel like I'm kind of covered on that, but basically room for improvement. So just again, it comes back to the point. I know knowing is not enough to help me make the right decisions. Doesn't work.
And I think it's almost dangerous, right? Because you could sort of sit there and go, because, and I fully admit I've done this, where I sort of go, well, I know about these things, so I am going to be smarter than the average person. I'm still an idiot, but I'm slightly smarter than the average, and therefore I don't need to worry as much. And I've seen myself take more risk in certain situations because I think I'm really good at this stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. But it makes you overconfident, doesn't it? Because you therefore assume, oh well, I'm going to be better than. It's like when you ask the question, are you better than the average driver, and everyone says yes, and obviously that's physically impossible. It's like, oh well, as a behavioural scientist working in finance, you must be better than the average. Absolutely not. I think one thing, I guess, is one benefit of that, if I can say it, makes me more empathetic, because I get really annoyed when people are like, oh, but how can people make decisions in this way? That seems so stupid. I'm like, hang on a minute, I do that all the time. It's not stupid. There are actually very rational. Again, and rational is a very loaded term, but actually very good reasons for behaving in the way we do. Like if you think back, I guess from an evolutionary perspective, in the caveman days, and our brains have not really changed from caveman days. We certainly didn't have, money or banking, and actually the things that mattered were day-to-day survival. And I think the evolutionary lens on financial decision making is a really important one, because it helps to explain quite powerfully why people do what they do without resorting to but people are just stupid or they don't know.
Yeah, and it's a very convenient narrative, right? Which is sort of like, let's not bother trying to understand the idiots, fools over there. And of course, it's that classic fundamental attribution error, which for listeners is you basically, why you're doing things, you don't know why other people are. Your reasons are incredibly valid. Their reasons are really stupid, even if you're doing the same thing.
Yeah. And to come back to that education point, and I mean when I say education, I mean kind of more the classroom, the leaflets, the kind of classroom type interventions. If you think about learning from more of a behavioural perspective, what customers need to learn is feedback, often on the outcome. So to make those decisions repeatedly, so practice, and then also to get feedback on the outcome of their decision. And if you think about the way financial products are designed, a lot of times we don't get the opportunity to learn. So if you think, for example, mortgages, the kind of choices that are making are called the one shot decisions. So you often do them once or twice in your whole life. So you don't have that chance to practice them, and you don't get feedback on is it a good decision, because often knowing it's a good decision is way off in the future. So you never know. So it's really hard as well to get better, which makes it harder to learn.
And I think, as ever with these things, like hindsight's a wonderful thing. So even if you were to turn around and go, that was a terrible decision, it might be a terrible decision with the benefit of hindsight. What you're not able to do is to put yourself in the position, and as you say, particularly where you've got something that's got a lead time of sort of decades rather than years or even months or weeks. Unsurprisingly, the world shifts, and we're not the same person we were. We're not in the same situation. So I think even sort of assessing, because it might have been the best decision you could have made based on, you wouldn't have been capable. Theoretically, you might have been capable if you had spent all your time doing a load of research, but that might not have been an option or within your sort of gift at that time. And so I think this is a fascinating point around, protection. And what's your view on consumer protection? Because the way you've been talking about these things is sort of, we clearly do need to protect consumers, because otherwise on the other hand, too much protection, wrapping people in proverbial cotton wool, doesn't necessarily feel like the right answer either. And you can push this argument sort of to extremities, but personal responsibility at some point comes into this as well. Where do you see the balances there?
Yeah. Oh, but that's a really good and really hard question. I think I think an example of where this challenge between, how paternalistic should regulators and companies be comes really much into play in that auto enrollment pension space. So, explain what auto enrollment was before, but the challenge is actually, does that mean that all the years that customers are saving into a pension, so in what pension people call the accumulation phase, does that mean that they're therefore less engaged? And because they're not, it's all done for them. You've made it a lot easier. We've made, taken that, all the effort they have to come out of it. But what that means is when they get to the again, what pension techie people call the decumulation phase, i.e., when you have to turn all the money you've saved into an income, when you retire, is then people are even maybe less well equipped to make that decision. So less well equipped, less confident, less engaged to make that really important, really difficult decision. So I feel like I'm going to sit on the fence on this one.
But that's probably the smartest place to be, right?
Actually, I'll say one thing. Actually, I was going to say, I'll say, yeah, maybe. When I went into the regulator, before I went into the FCA, I was a lot less paternalistic. Coming out the regulator, I've become a lot more paternalistic, which also politically, again, is a change, because I was quite, in my youth, I was much more on the, I guess, individual responsibility, and we should be responsible for our own decisions. And as I've learned more, I think both about, I guess, from a theoretical perspective about how we make decisions and how effective we are by context and the environment that we make those decisions in, and then working in the regulator and seeing up front all the complexity, all the things we talked about, the complexity, the dynamics, the challenges about, what the regulator calls behavioural market failures, which I can explain in a minute. It's made me way more paternalistic as a person and kind of politically. So yes, I do think there is some room for personal responsibility, absolutely. But I say in my view, that's got a lot smaller, and I think we probably need more consumer protection. But it's a really hard one. This is where I'm going to sit back on the fence. It's really hard, and where I come back to where things are really hard, let's experiment and let's see what works, rather than just making assumptions.
Right. And it's funny because it's sort of working the regulator made me realize why my decision never to go into politics was something that sort of confirmed it, because I just sort of thought, you know what?
Yeah.
Like, you're damned if you do. In many cases, you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. And there isn't an optimal solution.
Yeah.
And I'm always terrified now by sort of what I'll term sort of ideological zealotry, which is, kind of like, we have to do this. This is what we will do in all situations. And we can sort of pick political characters that we recognize that sort of don't seem to have any sense of nuance to what they do. I find that terrifying. And it was that situation of the realities of trade-offs that really made me realize I think I'm cut out for sitting on the fence, being inconsistent, screwing stuff up.
Or just say we need evidence. Yeah. Or that's my default is we need evidence. We need to collect more evidence, or we need to experiment, which again is not a political, again, in politics, that is just not something that.
And it looks weak, right? That's the other bit I find fascinating is there's a strength in what you said about you sitting on the fence. You kind of went, I'm going to have to sit on the fence. As soon as I go, I'm sorry, I'm going to sit on the fence. And I'm like, it's not a bad place to be to say, I don't know. And yet we seem to have in this world a sense of, you ought to know, right? You ought to be able to make your mind up it's a critic. And I actually think there's a strength in not knowing.
You're right, but it's actually interestingly on the Change My Mind podcast, which I run with a couple of ex-witch colleagues, we ask guests about the time they've changed their mind and why. This problem, the incentives, or rather the costs to changing your mind, particularly in a public arena, are so high, is one of the problems why politicians don't change their mind. So we had Jo Swinson on, who was the ex-leader of the Liberal Democrats. And we also had Sonia Soda, so she's one of the lead editorial writers at The Observer, so from the media side. And both of them, agreed that the cost, that as soon as politicians, or as soon as anyone in the public eye changes their mind or flip-flops or U-turns, Nick Clegg changing his mind on changing policy around student tuition fees, and they lost loads of Lib Dem supporters after that. is really costly. Like there's literally zero benefit from changing your mind in public because you do look weak. Although objectively, it's absolutely the right thing to do. And actually, some of the smartest people, like I think Daniel Kahneman is known for this, but actually admitting that you don't know um, is a lot of the time exactly the right thing to do. But both politically and public, you're penalised, and actually also in business. And Jeff Pfeffer, so Jeff Pfeffer is a management professor at Stanford. He pointed this out to us. He said it's really interesting. On the one hand, you've got a lot of management thinkers saying, you should bring your whole self to work, you should admit vulnerability, you should say, when you don't know. And he said, but actually, he said, when does that actually ever pay? It doesn't, because in leaders, the ones that get promoted are the ones that are really confident, who have all the answers, even though they might be the wrong answers or that they just make it up or bullshit. They're the ones that get to the top and get promoted. And again, we know from various studies that actually that perception of confidence is correlated with the perceived competence, but actually they're often negatively correlated. So actually, the more confident someone is, and the more they appear to know the answers, actually, the less they actually know in reality. So again, it comes back to that point. Yeah, you're exactly right. The costs, both in maybe politics and business, of admitting you don't know, saying we need more evidence, are really high, and the benefits in the longer term are there, but in the shorter term, they're not.
And that we beautifully, without even trying, we beautifully segued into the other thing that I wanted to
We
talk
did.
about, which is the Depolarization Project and your podcast. Can you just sort of give us a sense to talk about this? How do these things come about? What's it all about?
Yeah. So this is me, and then my two co-authors, two podcasters. We all met at Which. So we were all there, to try and make the world, not to sound cheesy, a better place. Whether using our individual experiences and backgrounds. But where it started from was Ali. So she went to the States, to Stanford, after we went our different ways after Which. And she set up a depolarization course there. So Ali has a background. She was the deputy chief exec here at the Lib Dems, and she's got a background in campaigning and mobilizing people. So she went to Stanford, to this graduate school of business out there, and set up with some of the political science professors a course on depolarization. And they had a bunch of in one of the sessions, they had a bunch of Trump supporters and a bunch of Democrats, and they were talking about various topics. And it was getting really heated in the room in that discussion. They were talking about various abortion, gun control, like very polarizing from an issue perspective topics. And Ali asked to, I think, both sets of people, when was the last time you actually changed your mind on one of these issues? And she said it was amazing, like in the room, it's something that you can only probably really see when you're actually in that room physically. So seeing people in 3D rather than over Zoom, but the tension melted away. And it was a question that actually on both sides really got people thinking and reflecting. And it moved people from a position of, trying to beat the other side, trying to denigrate the other side, to actually trying to understand and reflect. So the mood totally changed. The conversation totally changed. And people started talking to each other about, actually, when did I change my mind? Or why is it that I think what I think? So she, being very opportunistic, saw, actually, this is a really powerful question. There's a podcast here. So when she came back, as you do, she came back for drinks. We had drinks on the South Bank with one night. And she was like, actually, why don't we start a podcast on this and, put together our mutual, as you do, networks. And we were like, yeah, why not? So we did it in our bedrooms. We, bought a bunch of equipment from Amazon. So nowhere near as pro as you, Christian. And we partnered up with Open Democracy, and they on their platforms, they're an open news platform partners. We partnered with them. They put it on there, and we had some really interesting guests on it. So we've done 2 series so far, and then we had to pause because of the book. But basically, the gist of the podcast is asking leaders from politics, business, and academia about a time they've changed their minds and why, in the hope of trying to promote more tolerance and open discussion and understanding between people that have often very polarized views and really hate each other, not because of necessarily what they believe or think, but because of the groups they identify with. So it's something we called affective polarization. So often when people think of polarization, they think of issue polarization. So I'm anti-abortionist, you're pro-abortion. Actually, polarization, or I guess a more modern form of polarization, is people really disagreeing with each other, not because of what they think. So actually, on fundamental issues like, abortion is very hot. You might actually think the same thing, because you identify with different groups, so back to the US example, Republicans versus Democrats, you divide and you dislike people because of that. Again, we know in psychology, once you start thinking of people in terms of groups, whether it's race, gender, politics, profession, football teams is a great example. So you start thinking of people in terms of groups, that creates a whole bunch of negative feelings towards the out group and a whole bunch of positive feelings towards your in groups, the people that you identify with. And we see that in organizations, in teams, between division, we're all meant to be working for the same organization, but marketing versus legal, it creates basically an us and them, and psychologically in our brains is exactly the same thing as Man United versus Liverpool, black versus white, men versus females. It's exactly the same kinds of divides, and this is what we're seeing in I guess in the world, increasingly seeing in the world around us. It's not a new phenomena, but I think there's forces in the modern world, like tech, like social media, like the amount of uncertainty, that are maybe exacerbating our innate ancient tendency for tribalism.
And the podcast, it goes without saying, is brilliant. And it's fascinating because, you pick people. This isn't sort of like, I used to like chocolate ice cream and now I like vanilla. This is like serious stuff that you've got people on to kind of confront.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating for me because on the one hand, I listen to them and I'm quite reassured because I'm like, well, I don't have any extreme, clearly I'm smarter than these people as my start point. I don't have any extreme views. And then you start to go, hold on a minute, right? I don't think, I'm not making that mistake, but I'm making completely different ones. And I've got a whole ton of things, and I'll call it what it is, a whole ton of prejudices that I've had that I really need to question and start thinking about. And so I found it really enlightening because not only is it really interesting to hear other people's stories, but you give listeners a sense of, you might just want to think about yourself, because this, even if you're not somebody that believes X, we all have that, because that's how we navigate the world and sort of make decisions. We have to have that ability to use shortcuts. But I found it fascinating because I really started, I wasn't expecting this, but I found it I turned the lens on myself, and I didn't always like what I saw. But that's the whole point of challenging stuff. So I found it really powerful.
Yeah. That's brilliant. I mean, two points that spring to mind on that. So one point was, one of the guests in particular stands out for being, for having such a fascinating story on what he changed his mind about. It was a guy who was ex-Al Qaeda, so he was a bomb maker for Al Qaeda, and he changed his mind to such an extent he actually became an MI5 informant. So his story of why he changed his mind and what prompted that change was so powerful. We had so many. So much feedback afterwards, exactly that to your point, you just said that, wow, it really made me turn inwardly and think, actually, what have I changed my mind on and why? But second observation is, what struck us throughout the series with all our guests was that asking people that question, what have you changed your mind on? And when we ask that, we mean something more substantial. So again, not something like, I changed my mind what time for dinner, or who to date. That actually people find it a really hard question to answer, and they really struggle to think of something substantial that they have changed their mind on. So we've got a whole section on the book on this, is why is this case? Is it because is it because we don't change our minds on substantial things? We know that's not the case, because again, when you look at, how attitudes change over time on things like, for example, gay marriage, you do see these big shifts. So clearly we do change our minds. So is it then that people forget? Is it people that, again, a bit like childbirth, having a kid, it is immensely painful, speaking from experience, but we forget. And there's a really good evolutionary reason for why we forget, because otherwise we wouldn't have kids again.
Not
and that's
doing that again.
Human race.
Right, yeah.
Put it bluntly, exactly. So one of the hypotheses, and there is some evidence on this, is actually one of the hypotheses is that our brains, again, for an adaptive reason, have actually, it's almost like an amnesia. It's like a form of protecting ourselves, that we forget that we've changed our minds, because it feels really uncomfortable when we change our minds. There's something called cognitive dissonance, that we don't like to, we like to be consistent. So actually, when we do change our minds, it's our brain's way of making us feel better about ourselves, and that we just forget it. So again, that raised a whole bunch of really interesting questions for us on the podcast. Is why is it that people find it really hard to change their minds? And then, as we spoke about earlier, that's one thing. But then secondly, to actually admit changing your mind is another really hard thing, especially to do publicly, because it can make us seem weak. The costs are very high to publicly admitting that you change your mind.
Wow. So tell us, so the podcast is obviously available now, but when is the book coming out?
Yeah, so the book's coming out in September. It's called Poles Apart, with Penguin Random House, and it covers. I guess it starts from very much an individual perspective. So us as individuals, how do we form our views on these big things in life? Where do they come from? And then it goes out, it can broaden out from us as individuals to groups. So actually, why a lot of what we think is from not just as our individuals, sorry, from our families, from our how we grew up, but it's also from the groups that we identify with as we get older. And then we broaden out from groups to actually looking at society more broadly. So what impact does society have on what we think, and why it's so hard to change our minds, and why we polarize, why we divide, and why that division makes it even harder to change our minds. And then the last part of the book is then looking at, well, what can we do about that? And it's very much, the message is, it might feel uncomfortable, but we are all part of this problem. And actually, it was great. Our editor, who, a bit like you, Christian, was very indignant when we first started talking about this book proposal. He's very indignant. Well, I'm very open. I'm very intelligent. I change my mind and I assess the evidence all the time. And then we got on talk. This is around the time of it was just after it was a couple of years ago. So it was after the Brexit referendum. And when we said to him, okay, so do you actually have any friends that are non-Remainers? And have you actually ever talked to a Leave person? He was like, hell no. I don't know anyone that voted Brexit. All my friends are Remainers. I only ever watch news or that supports that prior view. And we were like, well, exactly. So how can you ever attempt to understand why people might have voted Brexit if you don't know them, you don't talk to anyone, if you don't even try to understand their perspective. And it's not that we want everyone to be nice, homogenous blob. It's not like we want everyone to be friends. This is not about being nice. This is about the disagreement is really important in our political system and for democracy. But what we're saying is that it's got to a point where this is not about facts. This is about our emotions, and we can't even stand people from the other side, which is why we don't talk to them and why we don't seek to understand why. It's just we want to denigrate and win. So it's a really big problem because we need people to come together and at least understanding opposing views are some of the biggest problems facing society. So climate change, inequality. We're not going to do it if we're shouting from very opposite sides of the fence saying I hate you, rather than actually let's try and figure out why this is and what might work to solve it.
Wow. I love that. What a great way to finish a fantastic conversation. So firstly, I just wanted to say thank you so much for the work that you've done in the behavioral science space, because you are one of the people that has inspired me to continue on my journey and has always kind of been there and been supportive and given me food for thought. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, secondly, for being on the podcast and being a great guest. And thirdly, I think the Depolarization Project and all the work that you're doing there, and I'm really looking forward to reading the book, is incredibly important in the modern world. All of which is something that I just want to say thanks, and thanks for appearing on the podcast.
Thank you, Christian. It's been a lot of fun, and I can't wait to listen to your next one. I think what you're doing is brilliant and very relevant to my work now, and polarization as well. So thank you.
Thank you. So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Alex for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about the Depolarization Project and the associated podcast Changed My Mind, have a look in the show notes. There are links to both there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a 5-star review for it, please do so. It really does help. To find out more about human risk, the work that I do with clients, and how you can mitigate the human risk within your organization, visit human-risk.com. I'll be back with another episode of this show very soon, but in the meantime, stay safe and thanks for listening.